Shabbat Shalom. This week we are in the Torah portion of Emor, which starts in Leviticus 21. And right away there was one interesting thing that caught my eye about this Torah portion. There's discussion of different things that the priest should and shouldn't do because they're set apart to Yahweh for the sacrifices. And the phrase that is being used multiple times here is that they offer Yahweh's offerings by fire, the food of their Elohim. So it must be holy. And when we read it that way, we think, okay, God's food, like he's just eating food like we do. It actually kind of makes me think of the Mexican holiday Dia de los Muertos, where they set out food on the altars, assuming that the dead people, come back and eat the food. And I thought, well, it can't just be that, like God doesn't need food. He doesn't consume food the same way we do. So what does this mean? And I looked a bit into it, like in the sense of looking up the definition of the Hebrew words that were there and trying to connect it contextually with what's going on. And so in Strong's, the word is food or meat or sustenance, but there's a note that says by implication to battle. And I found that really interesting. And so I started thinking about it, and I remembered the verse in Hebrews chapter 12, which says he is an all-consuming fire. And it says here in this portion of Leviticus that he consumes the sacrifices. And so I think the idea here is consuming, not food. We're focusing too much on the concept of food when the concept should be the consumption. And his sacrifices do completely consume it. In that sense, it is his food. But it carries this connotation of battling. And when Yahweh battles for us, he consumes our enemies totally and completely, as the Israelites saw that with the Egyptians. He went to battle for them, and the enemies were no more. And in Hebrews chapter 12, where it mentions that he's an all-consuming fire, it's talking about the shaking of the heavens and the earth that's going to come at the end of days. And it talks about how we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And hopefully we're on the right side of that kingdom. And then at the end it says, for our God is an all-consuming fire. And so I think that is the deeper message that's here with this phrase that keeps coming up in this Torah portion. And it just emphasizes why the priest's job was so important and to be taken so seriously. Then, it goes back to what happened with Aaron's sons when they offered the fire that wasn't commanded. They weren't taking the job seriously. And it has to be taken seriously because, well, as they found out, our God is an all-consuming fire. Now there's in this Torah portion, a lot is dedicated to discussing the feasts of Yahweh, Passover, unleavened bread, the Sabbaths, Shavuot. But there is an interesting aside that comes at the very end of the portion that's kind of like completely different topic, taking us out of the main narrative. And this is when there's a half-Israelite, the son of an Israelite woman, and an Egyptian father, blasphemes the name of Yahweh. And what's interesting is that you get record of his mother's name and his mother's mother's name, but there's no records of the father's name, whether it's his father or any fathers of his on his mother's side either. And his mother's name is Shelomith, which in Hebrew means peaceful. And her mother's name is Dibri, which means my word. Oh, and I find this so interesting because what's happening here is he is blaspheming the name of Yahweh. Could be, you could consider that blaspheming his word. But you have this juxtaposition here. The message coming through the name of his grandmother and his mother is that Yahweh's word is peaceful. What's also very interesting is that this guy comes from the tribe of Dan, which is the tribe that essentially started the idolatry of the Israelite people. And they're not counted in one of the counts of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're replaced with Ephraim and Manasseh. And so I find this really, really interesting and this cool connection here in this portion and in Leviticus previous portions, we see this concept of mixing, and that's really bad. I didn't talk about it for last week's portion, but with all of these sexual immoralities and sins that were discussed, there's the idea of man laying with man, which is considered an abomination. But then there's the idea of a woman laying with a beast, and there's a different word used there. And the word used for the abomination for the homosexual behavior is just immoral behavior. But the idea behind the Hebrew word that's used for the woman laying with the beast is like this mixing, and this unholy mixing is bestiality. So a man with man, at least you have a human with human. Now it's a question of morality and ethics. But a person lying with an animal, that's mixing, and that is considered wickedness. And so what you see with this person who blasphemed the name of Yahweh is you have a mixing of an Israelite and an Egyptian. And notice that the Israelite names of the mothers were carried through, and the meaning of their names were very important. But the father side, the Egyptian side, is lost. It's not recorded. And so I think this gives us a really interesting message and kind of prophecy about what would happen with the tribe of Dan, which is if we're not careful and we allow this mixture to happen, if we mix the profane with the clean, idolatry sets in, and then we are lost forever. We're not written in the book, and maybe we're not written in his book. So the other interesting thing about this is that the punishment involved the people who actually heard what was said, laying their hands on that person's head. This is very reminiscent of laying the hands on the head of the Azazel goat, the scapegoat. And then the entire community stoned him. So the ones who heard it were the ones essentially putting his guilt on him. But it was the entire community that stoned him. And I think that was important because the entire community had to purge the idolatry, the uncleanness out of the community so that it didn't come in as a sickness and take everyone down with it. And in verse 15, it even says, he shall bear his guilt, kind of confirming this idea of laying the weight of the sins on the head, which is exactly what happened with the scapegoat. So, really important spiritual message here at the very end of this Torah portion. And it was really kind of cool to find it and to draw and to make all those connections from it. So I hope you enjoyed this little tidbit, and if you found something else, there's a lot in this Torah portion we didn't discuss, so if there's something else you found that you're excited about or you just want to share, please do so. I'd love to hear it. Shabbat Shalom.